Hello. I got a story to tell. Turns out, it's like the umpteenth time I've told this. I have a new camera that I'm working to learn, Sony ZV-1, and it's got a learning curve to it. It's got a lot of fancy features. It's a nice camera, but you have to learn how to use it. And I finally figured out the settings, how to do these videos in low light with candlelight. I like to play with the lighting, as you could tell. Made a really good take on this story and watched it and noticed I had a big blob of food on my face. So here I am again. Okay, I'll get on. This has to do with my grandfather's passing, my mother's father. And I'm telling this story, it does have a paranormal ending to it, a spiritual side to it and a paranormal side to it. Same thing, but a little different. You'll see why towards the end. And I'm also telling this just kind of as a tribute to somebody I barely knew because I was a child when he died. But just what I remember of him and what my mom told me of him, and a little bit of family genealogy trivia for my cousins down south to they might be interested to know some of the stuff that my brother found out actually about the family. And then at the end of the story, it's got a spiritual and paranormal twist because when my grandfather passed away, he was at my house, my parents' house at the time. So at any rate, the idea for this story came, well, first I want to say, I decided I wasn't telling any more spooky stories for a while. The last spooky story I told about Bigfoot, the very last one of those, where they come from, I told that story and I started having some pretty not good things happen around here. And said a lot of prayers, and I just hope that's the end of it, quiets down. So no more spooky stuff for me for a while. I've got more stories, but right now I'm not going to tell anything spooky. This is not a spooky story, and you'll see why. I don't believe it's a spooky story at all, or I wouldn't be telling it when it has to do with somebody in my family. So a few days ago, about 4 days ago from the time it's recording, my cousins down in Virginia, some of them, they went to Culpeper Military Cemetery, where my grandfather, some of my uncles, my cousin, and some other family members who had some military service, and I think even one goes way back, he had military service with the Confederacy. Lo and behold, they were from Virginia. And, you know, they posted a picture of my grandfather's gravestone, which I've never seen before, on Facebook. And I've never seen it before, and I thought it was kind of neat in a way to see it. And when I looked at the dates, 1898 to 1970, I remember that day when he died. And that's where the story starts. But bear with me, because I'm going to tell some stories and genealogy and recollections and history behind the man. Here's a picture of my grandfather Jasper Wooten's gravestone, located in Culpeper Military Cemetery, Virginia. And you notice, you see that he served in World War I, and it tells the information on that, and he was born in 1898, so he was 19 or 20 years old when he saw combat in France against the Germans in World War I. And he actually was put in for the Medal of Honor, and I have his citations from 1919 when they were written up by his battalion, I believe, or division, I'm not sure which. And I've read them, and you gather that he was pretty much a one-man army in a certain battle, and I can't find it. I have them somewhere, you know, wrapped up, protected, his citations. My brother has his actual medals out west, and I have his citations, and I've got to find them and probably send them to be with the medal, I think. once I find them. But he had a pretty violent day, honestly. His battalion, their trenches were shelled, and the trenches caved in, and a lot of men were wounded or buried alive. And basically, here's a picture of him during this time. His military picture. Looks quite distinguished. I think he has kind of a hardened look on his face. But after reading what he went through, probably pretty shortly after this, or you would understand it. Yeah, his battalion was either killed, wounded, or they ran away. My grandfather stayed alone and dug men out that were buried in the trenches, his men, and went back to his machine gun numerous times and drove off several German counterattacks single-handedly. And basically he killed a lot of people and saved a lot of, you know, it's war, war's war. And they eventually got him with mustard gas, which he lost a lung. And that was pretty much probably the end of his combat service. And here's what I found on the internet on him, on his award. He was put in for the Medal of Honor, but the officer, the story goes, the officer that was recommending him for the Medal of Honor was killed in action. And so when they went to do the awards, that man obviously wasn't present to recommend him, so he got downgraded to a Silver Star, which is the second highest honor you can get in the American military. Oh, what else? I guess that's enough for that one. I want to get on with the story. So his last name was spelled Wooten, pronounced Wooten, spelled W-O-O-T-E-N. Here's a genealogy bit for my cousins. My brother did a lot of research, and actually the family goes way back in Virginia to 1607. I'm from Virginia originally, and they came here from England in 1607. The name Wooten originally was spelled in England and in America. Originally it was spelled W-O-T-T-O-N, which I would look at it and call it Wotton. So I have a feeling that it was pronounced Wooten in England, even though it was spelled like Wotton, W-O-T-T-O-N, because I know that the first immigrant of that line came here as a ship surgeon in Jamestown on one of the ships of Captain Smith when he landed in Jamestown, which are like among the first European settlers in America, if you're not counting Roanoke or Leif Erikson. And then he changed his spelling. He lived a long life in Virginia, and contrary, my mother had it wrong. They weren't Welsh coal miners. They were very wealthy, very, very well positioned English from Kent, England. They even had a castle. You can even look them up on Wikipedia. Some of them are, you can find them, you know, from the 1500s. They're pretty well positioned in England, very wealthy. And all right. And at some point he changed his spelling to W-O-O-T-E-N because he probably got sick of being called Wotton, like it was spelled, so he spelled it the way it sounds, the way it's pronounced, so Wooten. Anyway, on to my grandfather. He lost a lung in World War I, as I said. He had a pretty bloody day there in many ways. And after the war, my mother said that he drank a lot, whiskey. And not that he was a problem. He wasn't violent. He wasn't mean. He worked. He provided for his family. He was an upright man, but he drank. And, you know, if you read his war citations, you would understand why, probably. His generation, you know, his generation of men served in World War I. Then they went through the Great Depression, a lot of them, and they were what used to be called the hard-boiled man, they called them, his generation. And I learned that reading some books from Ernest Hemingway. I kind of got that. He was of the same generation, but they called him the hard-boiled man. They drank heavily. They're kind of hard-nosed guys. But my grandfather wasn't a bad person. My mom told me once their family was embarrassed. They lived in West Virginia in a small town. They lived out in the hills, really. And he never ever called him a hillbilly. That is a slur. But they lived out in the hills in West Virginia. And one day in the newspaper, probably in the 1940s, my mom was born in 35. On the front page of the newspaper was a picture of their main street, my mom told me. And lo and behold, there's her father walking down the sidewalk with a bottle of whiskey in his hand. And I guess they were pretty embarrassed about that. My mom told me this. And I don't mean to discredit him. Like I said, he was a good man. He wasn't a violent person. He wasn't a dropout. He worked. He earned good money. He was renowned for being a very good electrician. And people sought after him. Corporations tried to get him to work for them because he was a very good electrician, like industrial. So moving forward in his life, we're getting to his death. My mom said he drank heavily, and she said he smoked. Even though he only had one lung, he smoked heavily. And then when he was 50 or 55, she told me he accepted Jesus Christ into his life completely, and he stopped drinking and he stopped smoking. He just had a kind of a transformation from what she told me, that when he accepted Christ. And but he still had health problems. He had one lung, he had emphysema, he suffered from tuberculosis. He wound up moving out to Tombstone, Arizona, because the dry air was better for his lung conditions. Whatever, he had TB, which I think he survived that, but he had emphysema and other problems, probably from having one lung and whatever. On to me, we moved from Virginia to Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is right next to Arizona and Tombstone, where my grandfather lived. So when I was a little child, I remember going to Tombstone to go see him on occasion. It was a few hour drives, and we were there at Tombstone. And this is back in the 60s. And it was a small town, really small town, just kind of living off its Wild West claim to fame, shootout at the OK Corral, Wyatt Earp and all that, Doc Holliday, all that lore was still around then, still around today. And my grandfather lived outside of Tombstone in the desert, in a little shack, as I recall. I'm just going to put pictures of him up randomly as I find them while I'm talking. And I thought that was pretty cool. He just lived by himself, this wiry old man in his shack, really just like, wasn't much of a house, this little stone hovel. But he had little plants and gardens, and I recall he really loved to entertain people. He loved to talk. He was a very good listener. That's what I remember about him. So eventually we moved from New Mexico to San Jose, California. And I remember what the hippies were like, because I lived in San Jose, California as a child in the mid-60s. And from San Jose, California, we moved to West Virginia. Then I got to find out what hillbillies are like. Appalachian people. Hillbillies is a derogatory term to some. Appalachian people, and I'm an Appalachian person. I've lived in the Appalachian Mountain Range my whole life. And even where I live now in New York State is part of the Appalachian Mountain Range. It goes all the way up, right on up to Maine, the mountains. And so you've got Appalachian people down south, and you got Appalachian people up north, and in Pennsylvania and up north, all the way up. And so I've been an Appalachian person myself. Well, we wound up moving from West Virginia to Sodus, New York. My father he was an engineer. He worked designing things, electrical engineer. He always had good jobs. My mom was a stay-at-home mom with 4 kids. And my dad made a good income. And he worked for NASA, he worked for military corporations, he designed things. He didn't have a problem finding work, but he liked to move around a lot, because we did. We wound up living in upstate New York. I think we moved here in 1969 or 1970. And we lived in Sodus, which is a nice little town right on the shores of Lake Ontario. Sodus is a farming town known for a lot of apple trees, a lot of cherry trees, and really good fishing on the lake, Sodus Bay. And it hasn't changed much since. It hasn't at all, really. I returned there recently. I'm like, wow, this town hasn't changed. Just different people, you know. Or the people I knew are now my age, or dead, or gone, or older. But I live about 50 miles from there now. I just never really went back. Didn't have a cause to after I joined the Army. But so we're living in Sodus, and my grandfather's health took a turn for the worse. And I warned you I was going to digress on this, just to talk about memories. So he moved from Tombstone, Arizona, up to be with family during his final days, final time here, so he could visit with his children, my mother, in this case. And I guess his health, he was staying with us, living in our house. We had a big house on a nice quiet street. And his health took a turn for the worse even more, and my mom decided she needed to go down to Virginia to pick her younger sister up and bring her up to stay with us so that she could spend time with her father as well in his last days here. So I recall my father stayed at our house with her father, and my mother packed us boys up, there were four of us, counting myself. We had a station wagon, I remember, big old station wagon with bench seats. And we drove down to Virginia, Quantico, Virginia to be precise. And to pick up her younger sister, Glenna. My mom was 35, Glenna would have been in her mid-20s. So we picked up her sister and we're driving back north, and I'm getting towards the end of the story. We're getting back north, heading north, and I remember we were in Pennsylvania. My brothers and I were in the back seat in the station wagon, and they were sleeping. It was late at night. I wasn't sleeping, you know, and my mother and her sister, my mother was driving, it was nighttime, the roads were dark, you know, and her sister was sitting on this side, and they were talking and gabbing, they were laughing, they were really enjoying each other's company. And I'm just kind of sitting there on the bench seat between them, behind them, not talking to them, because I'm just a kid, you know, and just kind of watching the road and the headlights in front of the car. And my mom and her sister were just having a very lively conversation, cheerful, upbeat, laughter, I remember. And spontaneously, my mother started crying. She was laughing, and then right in the middle of the laughter, she started crying hysterically. And my Aunt Glenna, she had a southern accent like my mom did then. She says, Patty, Patty, what's wrong? And my mom said, I don't know, something happened to Dad, I just know it. Something happened to Dad, I just know it. And she was still crying, and for a bit. And in this year, 1970, there weren't convenience stores brightly lit 24/7 open all the time. There wasn't lit up rest areas. This is 1970. And the road, as I recall, it was late at night, and there was very little traffic, if any, and it was dark. And gas stations back then, they closed at 9. Everybody went home, lights off, you know. Gas stations back then, they had gas pumps. Some of you remember this. They had a couple of gas pumps. They had a couple of garage bays where they'd work on your car. Usually when you're getting gas, some pimple-faced kid would come out and pump your gas, wash your windshield if you wanted, and if you wanted, he'd check your oil in your car. Because apparently oil needed to be checked a lot more back then in your car. And they'd have a tow truck also there to pick you up if they got a call. Other than that, they closed at 9 p.m. And I remember my brothers and I used to laugh. They always sold the same stuff. Candy bars, bubble gum, condoms, that's right, condoms, cigars and cigarettes, and soda pop out of a machine, you know, and we called it soda pop back then. It'd come in a bottle, you know, for 20 cents, something like that, or a quarter. And yeah, blast from the past. So my mom's driving up the road and feeling that something bad had happened to her father. She finally comes to a gas station. It was dark. I do remember this stuff. Pulled over. Us kids stayed in the car and everything. I think Glenna stayed in the car too. My mom went to, there was a pay phone. There was nobody there, but there was a phone booth. She made a phone call. She came back to the car, and yes, she informed her sister that Ray, her husband, my father, told her that their father had just passed away not long before the phone call. So that's the spiritual part of this story. My mom had a spiritual connection to her father like that, and she knew instinctively that he died when he died. There's more to this story, but though it's drawing to a close. I must say my mother passed away at the time of this recording 6 or 7 months ago, January 21st, 2021, of COVID. And I couldn't be with her. And I didn't have that experience, you know, for whatever reason. I got a phone call at about 11 at night from the home she was at where she died. So, but my mother had that experience when her father passed. And we got home, and I remember this quite clearly. The next day, my father was talking to my mother about her father passing away. And remember, my father was there with him alone in the house the night he died. And I remember my dad said, funny thing happened. He's talking to my mom, but I'm listening. Funny thing happened, he said, right after your father died. He said that somebody started whistling that old song, Bluebird. That was his favorite song that he always loved, that song Bluebird. And he said somebody started whistling that song all through the house. And my father said, I looked to see, you know, who it was. He thought somebody was pranking him. My dad didn't believe in ghosts at that time. He said he'd go into one room and there'd be nobody in there. Then he'd hear it, somebody whistling that song in another part of the house, and he'd go check, expecting to find somebody playing a prank on him. And there was nobody there. And, you know, it's pretty obvious my grandfather was making his presence known right after his spirit left his body. But he was whistling his favorite song, Bluebird, and my dad said apparently it went on for a while in the house. The way my dad was telling my mom about this incident. And he said he kept looking all over the house expecting to find somebody whistling that old song, but he didn't find anyone, obviously. And it was my grandfather's favorite song, Bluebird. And my grandfather was born in 1898, so that song probably might have been a top hit in 1915 or 1925, you know, who knows. I'll look it up and try to find it. I just wanted to share that for my cousins. That's why I'm kind of talking about a little bit of family stories here on this story, because just for posterity's sake, my mom's gone now, but I'm sharing her recollections of her father, and I'll be gone before I know it. And so I wanted to share this part of my recollections of the day he died, and my recollections of him, what little I knew of him as a kid when he was alive. He was the only grandparent I got to know out of all my grandparents, was him. And I just remember him as being a wiry old man that he had a great sense of humor, and he was very clever and very witty, and he had a very sharp sense of humor, honestly. Kind of like me. I think I inherited that from him, because sometimes I joke with kids and they get, you know, rubbed the wrong way by it, and I'm just trying to be funny. And yeah, he was kind of the same way, but he was a good guy. He was a good guy, and my mother said that he gave his life over to Jesus Christ in his 50s, thank God. And so I'm pretty sure he's home with the rest of my family. There's growing numbers there with our Lord Jesus Christ, where we'll all meet up someday, and you know, the Lord. So that's really the story, and I wanted to pass that on about that little bit of history and a story. And it's not really that uncommon for these sort of things to happen sometimes when people pass on. You know, my father eventually would come to believe in ghosts, but when he was about 75, I think, or 80, probably more like 80. He lived to be 86. He experienced some hauntings in my mother's house. He told me about them. And he thought they were funny. But he said, yeah, I believe in it now. He didn't really make a big deal out of it, but he thought it was kind of funny. You know, he told me about some things I won't go into. That's not part of this. And my father was an agnostic, but he gave his life. He accepted Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. And he was very lucky to have the time to do that, because he did that not long before he died. But he did. And I just want to share these things. So that's it. I don't know what's going on with this channel. Probably more beer reviews. You know, I question whether they have a place on this channel, beer reviews. I don't really drink a lot of beer, believe it or not. I used to. I've cut back a lot in the interest. The usual reasons people cut back at my age drinking a lot of beer. You know, trying to see that beer gut disappear. One of them. But my sons got involved with the beer reviews, and they like doing these, and so do I, really. It's kind of fun. We do them once in a while. My younger son, but they're not children by any means. They're old enough to call their own shots. Kyle likes to do the beer reviews with me when we're together, and my son Tim loves to do the artwork on the thumbnails, and he's very good at that. So I'm going to be doing some of those, probably playing some more music. I was a first responder at the World Trade Center. We're coming up on the 20-year anniversary of that event, and I want to tell of my experiences as a first responder right on the World Trade Center site, right after they got knocked down in 2001. And I've got a few photographs, not many, and some recollections of some tragic, sad things that happened there that did not make the news for good reason. I want to thank you for tuning in, those of you that still do. It's an honor to have this time to just talk to you like this. So thank you, and God bless you all. Guess I don't get to make a wish. Oh, right.